讲讲毛主席什么的。
毛主席是永远不落的太阳，一路滋润禾苗壮，但革命靠的是毛泽东思想。东方红，太阳升，中国出了个毛泽东，他为人民谋幸福，他是人民的大助手。浏阳河穿过了1000道湾，你的水路到底湘江，江边上出了个湘潭县，出了个毛主席领导我们得解放，出了个毛主席实现法治啊！毛主席的光辉照到了雪山上，我们要按他的最高指示办，文化大革命，是为了使我们无产阶级的江山不要旁落到资产阶级手里。毛主席文化大革命是
The human sensibilities of decency were seen as the traits of capitalists which they sought to rid themselves of in an orgy of bloodshed and senseless violence. This revolutionary fervor swept through every aspect of society. Wherever there were old grudges, existed an opportunity for revenge. For instance, in the countryside, the peasants had been sorely mistreated by the commune authorities during the Great Leap Forward. It was these commune organizers that had sold the peasants only grain and made them melt down their metal objects from farming tools to personal keepsakes, ultimately leading to the famine. With Mao declaring open season on supposed capitalist oppressors, the peasants now had the perfect excuse to destroy those that had held power over them. Slighted, humiliated, bullied, cowed, demeaned in real or imagined ways, this was the opportunity for the peasants to strike back. It now makes perfect sense why their lives had been so miserable for so many years. The commune organizers were secretly oppressive, capitalist slave masters, and Mao had come to their rescue by allowing them to strike back against their oppressors. As usual, Mao was the savior, as opposed to the Machiavellian maniac who caused the suffering of the people in the first place. The people who directly engaged in violence were still a relative minority though. For the tens of millions of Chinese youth across the country, what could characterize their time during the revolution was boredom and monotony. There was simply nothing for them to do. Although they were still made to attend school, most of the teachers had been denounced, leaving the kids to teach themselves or just to hang around until it was time to go home. With Madame Mao practically banning every book before 1949, there wasn't anything else left to read. There were no dances allowed beside the official loyalty dance. There was no art to be had besides the art that conformed to party aesthetic. The same goes for singing songs and playing musical instruments. Non-party related music was bourgeoisie. The creation of anything could be construed the wrong way and leave one in a precarious position, so nothing new was created, leaving the country in total sterility and soullessness. Thanks to Madame Mao, there was a puritanical repression of human closeness. All references to love were scrubbed from culture. When a Vietnamese song and dance troupe was viewed by select Chinese officials and their families, the Chinese announcer had to explain that the love featured in the theatre was in fact nothing more than comradely affection. In the only foreign movies allowed in the country, which were Albanian or Romanian, which could only be seen by a privileged group, all scenes where men and women were seen to be standing too close to each other were cut out. The lack of human closeness no doubt left the youth of that generation emotionally stunted. Even though there was nothing to do, leisure wasn't tolerated either. Red Guards would march into tea houses and chase away the customers because there was a revolution going on, and leisure was bourgeoisie. As such, tea shops closed down. The same went for other acts of leisure: sports, cards, chess, operas, films, concerts, all erased. The very decorative features that lined the inside of a building was considered bourgeoisie, causing it to be vandalized. The decorative turrets of walls and gates, the carved eaves of tiled roofs, the stained glass windows with colourful patterns on them were all diligently smashed. Any flat surface besides the ground was vandalized with big character posters with slogans that evoke feelings of disgust and anger for onlookers. People's homes would fill up with clutter, giving way to full-on hoarding as residents became too afraid to throw away the older newspapers and trash that may have had a picture of Mao Zedong on it or his name written. If one was seen throwing out an item such as a newspaper with a picture of Mao on it, it could lead to a denunciation. For those unable to secretly dispose of their garbage, they were forced to let the rubbish decompose within their own homes. In fact, the first large-scale factional fighting amongst Red Guard cliques was when one Red Guard inadvertently went for a seat and wound up sitting on a newspaper, which no doubt would have had Mao's face printed on it. As if the world couldn't possibly look more bleak, the students were commanded to go out to the school grounds, parks and fields to pull flowers up by their roots. With beauty being considered a symbol of bourgeois decadence, not a single flower remained. Even the grass was not spared, as lawns were the stuff of capitalist landlords and a symbol of their oppression, and so every blade of grass was painstakingly removed by hand. Parks and school grounds became vandalized blights. For the same reason, the decadent birds with their melodic tweeting were plucked from their nests, and the colourful carp that adorned the lakes and fountains were fished out of their habitats and destroyed. Not even the dead could escape the revolution. Tombstones were smashed, coffins were exhumed, and mausoleums were vandalized. Life was dull, life was ugly, life was robbed of colour, sweet smells, pleasant sounds, and beautiful sights. The girls tried to dress and act like men. They consciously attempted to suppress their femininity, as women's femininity was a decadent bourgeoisie trait. Women should be crass, argumentative, hostile, militant, and cast aside their dainty characteristics lest they come to resemble a bourgeois housewife. Mao was an ardent feminist, and his statement that women held up half the sky ran deeper than mere political pandering. With women totally being the equal of men, his wife, Madame Mao, taking her husband's statements to its natural conclusions, sent women out to the same brutal work conditions that men were exposed to. They were sent into deep underground coal mines, they were sent into salt mines, they were brutalized out in the farm fields, frequently expected to do as much or at least almost as much physical labor as the men. With no extracurricular hobbies, no education, and no work, school started to lose its gravitational pull, and students would steadily float away until millions of youth found themselves sojourning all around China. With millions of volatile young people aimlessly roaming around the country and with some armed to the teeth, Mao suddenly had a change of heart and perhaps realized that the youth was much more of a potentially destabilizing force for him than the Khrushchevs he had been at war with. He decided to take radical action. The students were to learn from the proletariat. They would be their teachers. By the end of 1968, all university students were summarily graduated en masse without examination, assigned jobs, and were forced to disperse over every corner of the country. A short while later, it would be all high school, then all middle school students, until 15 million had gone to the countryside. Mao maintained that people with some education were inferior to illiterate peasants, and thus he would say, quote, "Peasants have dirty hands and cow poo on their sodden feet, but they are much cleaner than intellectuals," end quote. For in those days, to be intelligent was a trait of the capitalist oppressors, and thus ignorance became the new morality, making the most ignorant of society the ideal role models for the youth. This meant shipping them off to every corner of the country to work on communes and in factories. This way, he could inculcate the students with the ethic of the ignorant proletarian peasantry and keep them out of the bourgeoisie clutches of city life. He called this re-education, and it would be a true re-education that Mao simply could not have foreseen. The sparkly-eyed young socialists who had lived their lives in the cities were mostly exempt from witnessing the horrors of the Great Leap Forward and the commune system. The social theories that they clung to with a religious zeal is something that they had never seen the practical use of in person. Abolition of private property, collectivization, and socialist economics were ethereal ideas that floated above them in a fictional reality, and now the rubber was going to meet the road. It is on the communes that students were truly re-educated. It might have taken only a day or 10 years for them to traverse the hard and difficult journey towards the truth. The truth being that their life existed within some kind of monstrous myth. Kids were sent out into conditions of medieval drudgery. On the communes, the peasants taught the kids about gut-wrenching poverty as they ate like the peasants. They taught the kids about back-breaking forced labor, which was their lot in life. They taught the kids about life being nasty, brutish, and short. In keeping consistent with anti-capitalist ideology, they didn't have tractors or any modern farming equipment. Communes didn't even have draft animals to till the soil with, a technology that humans had had for thousands of years. The farming process, for the most part, was done painstakingly by hand and often with lack of farming equipment due to them being sacrificed into the pyre that was their backyard furnaces. With men and women being equal, the girls suffered greatly as they were made to toil with the same effort as the boys. The peasants taught them, inadvertently of course, that the world they live in was one that created privation for even the most basic essentials. Often being sent to the most desolate and impoverished places, the kids often lacked warm clothing and blankets, all while firewood was scarce and coal was too expensive. In some provinces, up to half of the students were staying in caves, sheds, and abandoned pigsties. Many students would come to learn from their peasant teachers that things weren't always so wretched for them. With their lack of sense of the current taboos of the urbanites, peasants would casually fill in the blanks regarding missing information their kids had about the Great Leap Forward. For instance, perhaps in explaining why they had no farming tools or cooking equipment, or why they lived in dilapidated houses. Despite the fact that literacy was one of the key focuses for the Communist Party, the youth were also surprised to learn that the peasants were completely illiterate, not even being able to write their own name. The few teachers that the countryside churned out were met with denouncements, and as such, classrooms sat empty for almost a decade. The evening classes the peasants of the communes were forced to attend after a day of back-breaking labor was nothing more than listening to a team leader read the People's Daily to them. They would then be educated on the latest political jargon, then given some valuable peasant advice from Mao, such as, Chairman Mao says to eat 2 meals of rice porridge and only 1 meal of solid rice per day. For the urban youth, they'd been taught to lionize the peasantry, who were the glorious backbone of the nation. Heck, their red color status puts them on par with the families of officials. Colorful and cheerful propaganda posters showcase the prosperity and the soul of China's revolution, painting a picture of abundance and culture for the peasantry. Yet in the flesh, they find only the opposite to be true. The peasants were crass and undignified. They spat, they were unhygienic, they were rude. Many of the urban youth came to resent their peasant hosts and came to the obvious conclusion: there is no dignity in poverty. The powerful conditioning of Mao was so strong that it was unbreakable for many, despite their horrendous suffering, leaving many with fond memories of the chairman to this day. But for most, the arduous years of forced labor left them with a stinging bitterness as they came to realize the truth. The truth was never spoken and often not allowed to pierce through the veil of their consciousness. Mao had sent me to my death, they would come to realize. And the country that was told to be the envy of the world was in fact hell on earth. As the years drew on, the youth would learn for the first time the key to survival was practical skills rather than political rhetoric. And for even the most zealous Red Guards who had been sent away from their loved ones to suffer in silence, they too would come to the realization that all their political actions had been for nothing. Then suddenly, on September 1971, an auspicious wind blew that pertained to a coming change. Lin Biao, Mao's right-hand man, the architect of his cult of personality, issuer of the Little Red Book, is found dead in a plane crash over Mongolia. The public was stunned. Regardless of the reason for Lin Biao's purging, the obvious assassination of Mao's primary supporter could only mean one thing: things were going to change. And although not known to the people of the time, Mao's days were numbered. Lin Biao was the key component of Mao's control over the People's Liberation Army, a position unlike any other that was difficult to fill with loyal cadres. This also weakened the conviction in the Cultural Revolution, of which Lin Biao was a huge part of. Mao was disturbed by this incident, and unlike the time he purged his countless other comrades like Peng Dehuai, Mao became depressed and suffered a stroke on January 1972. It's at this time in Mao's life that he became nostalgic about some of his revolutionary comrades whose purgings Lin Biao had supported, and with the help of Zhou Enlai, Mao would conduct a widespread rehabilitation campaign of veteran revolutionaries who had been persecuted. Mao also corrected some of the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, which he blamed on Lin Biao's zealotry. Whether Mao had come to grips with sanity for the first time, or whether he had come to fear for his continued rule without Lin Biao, the times were set to change. Because Lin Biao was the one that headed the machinery of the Cultural Revolution, Mao's grip of control over the revolution began to wane. This led to a trickle of people slowly wandering out of the camps, never to return. With slightly less oversight, farmers started raising pigs in secret for sale on the black market to financially support themselves. Confiscated bourgeoisie items that had last been seen during Red Guard house raids started to feature in the underground black markets, where forbidden books like classical Confucian literature or Shakespeare were secretly sold by Red Guards or party officials. With the economy in shambles and few things being made, even the most hesitant would reluctantly be forced to go out to these black markets, as it became the only place you could buy life-saving medicine like antibiotics. The worst fears of Mao were coming to fruition. The secretly harbored capitalist culture that Mao sought to oppress had been reawakened within the people. If the economy didn't resume normalcy, the game would be up, and perhaps for the first time in the past 10 years, Mao came to his senses. With the Cultural Revolutionary Authority functionally inadequate, he partially put an end to his utopian fantasy and reinstated the disgraced officials who he had brutalized for years. Although Liu Shaoqi couldn't preserve his sanity and his life past 1969, the other hounded officials like Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai somehow survived long enough to be reinstated in full. Zhou Enlai was given full control of the steering wheel by Mao, which brought back much of the Communist Party administration, liberalized the economy by allowing peasants to make money again, and restarted scientific research while schools resumed proper teaching once more. Owing to the normalization efforts of the pragmatists, or as Mao would call it, the oppressive capitalist principles that had been implemented by those secretly harboring capitalist intentions, the country was brought on the path to recovery. For some reason, despite all of Mao's efforts to bring on a communist utopia, the country was brought into hell, and as he was forced to pick up the slack from the dead Lin Biao and directly administer governance himself, Mao had come to see the true train wreck that lay before him without the rose-colored filter of his sycophantic party lackeys who kept him in the dark. Mao had spent the past decade wondering who was going to be his Khrushchev, who it was that was going to lead China astray from the righteous revolutionary path, who was going to take the country back down the path of oppressive capitalism. Mao, the perpetual irony machine that he is, wows the public with his unprecedented hypocrisy and backsliding in a way never thought possible. Despite a literal war on anything remotely capitalist, from singing birds to Nikita Khrushchev, Mao did the absolute unthinkable, something that no one would have believed possible amidst the Cultural Revolution. He accepted US President Richard Nixon on the 21st of February 1972 to resume harmonious diplomatic relations between mainland China and the US. Dubbed the week that would change the world by Nixon, China would literally change in a flash. In all the locations that Nixon had visited, the streets were cleaned up of its aggressive big character posters, along with the revolutionary names of streets and shops, which returned back to normal. Whole streets were cordoned off from public view to make way for the private motorcades of the capitalists, and the face of the king of capitalism himself was photoed shaking hands with Mao, a picture glowingly splashed on the front of the People's Daily for all to witness. This sudden change of direction was a stupendous whiplash for hundreds of millions who had thrown their lives away for the revolutionary cause, leaving them in a state of total shock. Without explanation, winning friends from all over the world became the new slogan, and it suddenly became patriotic to learn English, the language of the capitalist oppressors. As the country's economy lay in tatters, and millions of Red Guard youth in communes across the country ate nothing but a meal or two of cabbage soup a day, the tabloids bragged about how many dishes Henry Kissinger had stuffed his face with that day. From this point on, the cult of Mao had its foot to the gas and the brake pedal at the same time, all the way down to the floor. Across the country, millions of youth were still being sent to the communes, but at the same time, factories built for serving the American capitalists had opened all across the country. Many of the Cultural Revolutionary era policies were still in full swing, but people slowly began to stop brutalizing their co-workers, classmates, and loved ones. It was clear that the Cultural Revolution and the jarring whiplash caused by Lin Biao's death and the Nixon visit put people in a daze where they didn't know what to believe anymore. As the new decade unfolded, fewer and fewer people joined the Communist Party for ideological reasons. Everyone towed the party line about how they wanted to bring glory to the party, but with the ideological backsliding unfolding, it became primarily the vehicle for personal advantage. Despite the steady march towards normalcy, the cult of Mao was desperately trying to maintain its monopoly by all those who relied on Mao's favor for their own social and economic advancement. Case in point, his wife. As China became forcefully exposed to Mao's hypocrisy and the country tiptoed towards liberalization, Madame Mao stood firm like the German Wehrmacht, resisting the advance of the Soviet juggernaut in 1944. With Mao now courting foreigners and giving up power to the likes of Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, Madame Mao was now solely responsible for upholding the cult of Mao. But without the efficacy of Lin Biao's management, Madame Mao's guidance of the Cultural Revolution appeared increasingly unhinged in a time that was clearly changing. With Zhou Enlai turning the wheels of production back on, Madame Mao was quick to intervene in his progress. In industry, Madame Mao's slogan was, "To stop production is revolution itself." In agriculture, which was making a comeback, she spread propaganda that said she would rather have socialist weeds than capitalist crops. As China began acquiring foreign technology, she would retort that China was sniffing foreigners' farts and calling them sweet. As regular education had resumed, she propagandized, "We want illiterate working people, not educated spiritual aristocrats." On January 1974, Madame Mao made another desperate push to reclaim lost ground and once again called for children to rebel against their teachers. Chairs were once again thrown through windows, teachers harassed by their students, and textbooks set on fire. However, Madame Mao's call to action had diminishing returns, and soon after the rebellion, school returned back to normal as if nothing had happened. This was a disaster for Madame Mao, as it was only through destruction that her and her Cultural Revolution luminaries had a chance to shine. The focus of Madame Mao's beam of destruction was Zhou Enlai, which she disparagingly referred to his Confucian behavior as Confucian-like, as he appeared to epitomize all the virtues of Confucian principles. Perhaps 5 years ago, such accusations would have led to Zhou Enlai's lynching, but as the times had progressed, Zhou Enlai's Confucian image only bolstered his support. The power play between Zhou Enlai and Madame Mao represented the struggle within the country itself, a desire to return to normalcy, but also a desire to maintain endless revolution. For this reason, China became a land of striking, nonsensical contradictions. Mao could only watch on helplessly, whether due to age, the stress of Lin Biao's death, or the steady but sure evaporation of his utopian fantasy. Mao was stricken with fatally ill cancer, and China's fate now seemed to lay beyond his control. In Mao's twilight years, he looks withdrawn, and the revolutionary vigor that had animated his life form seemed to have been replaced with a crude caricature of what he once represented. Even if the people remained ignorant, it would seem impossible by now that Mao couldn't still be largely unaware of the reality of his rule. As he looked on at his legacy, of which he was so self-conscious about, he could say that without a doubt that he tried to run a successful socialist nation. He perhaps tried harder than any other socialist leader in world history, and in no other country could such an experiment have had the greatest chance of success. He had tried the collectivized farming practices that had been espoused by Marxists for over a century, only to have such plans devastatingly fail. He could say without a doubt that he tried to quash the secret hand of capitalism that rot the nation from within, yet even after every nook and cranny of the country poured out supposed capitalist traders, the state of the nation never seemed to improve. And lastly, he can without a doubt say he became a god and tried to change the very nature of a human being. This too ultimately led to failure. Mao feebly looked on as the incumbent Zhou Enlai headed China's counter-revolution. This involved no violence or political propaganda. More and more, people just silently slipped out of the communes and returned home. Schools went back to teaching reading and writing instead of violent slogans. Farmers started planting more crops than they were allowed to farm. Peasants made shoes and hats to sell to neighbors, and gangs of youth would roam the countryside selling capitalist contraband. Although the revolution began with the average person screaming bloody murder at every conceivable notion for 10 years, the revolution ended in the opposite way. People simply went on with their lives and just forgot about it. Despite the steady return to normalcy, the power struggles at the top continued and continued to claim fresh victims. On January 8, 1976, Zhou Enlai too, like many others, would meet his fate. Despite surviving the most harrowing years of the Cultural Revolution, Zhou was simply becoming too old to put up a fight and was hounded mercilessly by Madame Mao and her Gang of Four. Being the final holdouts of the Cultural Revolution, Madame Mao and her posse were excessively savage in their final years, perhaps sensing that their demise was at hand. With Mao's health waning, it was important for Madame Mao to secure her legacy and ensure the nation's love for her even in the absence of her husband. Her persecution of Zhou Enlai was a grievous miscalculation though, and clearly demonstrated her ignorance of the current changing times. Instead of people cheering for his death as Madame Mao had hoped, they publicly mourned his death. Being seen as the loyal Confucian who avoided petty drama and simply focused on the running of the country, people all over China associated Zhou's leadership with the return to sanity in China. This outcome shocked Madame Mao, who would then be forced to continue her beef with Zhou Enlai's ghost from beyond the grave. She ordered the people through propaganda not to mourn for the capitalist traitor, Zhou Enlai, implying that mourning for the denounced leader would possibly bring denouncements on themselves. Unperturbed, people would even more loudly and more publicly express their grief as a silent act of protest against Madame Mao. With Madame Mao's whole weight resting on Zhou Enlai's persecution to support her own authority, she would collapse with no one left to persecute. Once again being the preeminent political figure in China ahead of all but Mao, there was no one else she could blame for the state that China was in, and so she placed her aim at Zhou Enlai's replacement, Deng Xiaoping. It would seem that Madame Mao's ruthlessness towards Zhou Enlai had used up her life force, and this time, every attack made against Deng Xiaoping only elevated his public image. Now, to be the enemy of Madame Mao was to be a hero, and every attack doubled down as a compliment that would draw people's attention to Deng Xiaoping's sound leadership qualities. Soon, accusing someone for lacking revolutionary qualities became a high point for them. Still controlling the Cultural Revolutionary Authority, workers and students in their work teams throughout the nation were forced to denounce Deng Xiaoping, but such activities had been relegated down to the kind of formality that can be seen by someone who attends church and sleeps during the duration of the service. With the hatred of Madame Mao escalating, the country broke out into the country's first major full-on protest in the spring of 1976. Instead of placards and angry chants though, hundreds of thousands of people convened in Tiananmen Square, bringing nothing more than their tears for Zhou Enlai's death. The crying protest brought to witness huddled masses of people wailing in public as if for their own loved ones. With a public act of bereavement for Zhou Enlai a denounceable offense, the bringing together of so many dissident voices was cause for alarm for Mao, even in his deteriorated state. Fearing a Hungarian-style revolt, Mao allowed his wife to take whatever action necessary to maintain the status quo. The police cracked down on the protest, arresting hundreds, and with Madame Mao seemingly coming out on top once again, she used the occasion to blame Deng Xiaoping and throw him into the sacrificial pyre, and was able to get him demoted from office. With Madame Mao having solidified herself once again as top dog, the problem again was that there was simply no one powerful enough to persecute to maintain her grip on power. Madame Mao was fast running out of options. On the 28th of July, there was an earthquake in a city near Beijing called Tangshan. News broadcasts across the nation reported of a terrible earthquake. Such news was strange because there was never bad news reported in the media like this. A total of 242,000 people had died and 164,000 badly injured, one of the most deadly natural disasters in world history. Although Madame Mao and her Cultural Revolutionary Authority were totally inept in dealing with real-world problems, she endeavored to remain front and center of the disaster and feign real leadership without actually doing anything. With thousands of victims still trapped in the rubble, The Gang of Four warned that the nation must not be diverted by the earthquake, but instead remember their primary priority to continue to denounce Deng Xiaoping. Madame Mao said, quote, "There were merely several 100,000 deaths. So what? Denouncing Deng Xiaoping concerns 8 million people." Meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping and the growing voices of reason within the Communist Party scrambled to rally citizens to build temporary shelters for refugees and send aid workers to rescue trapped villagers. Deng Xiaoping's efforts would be continually impeded by Madame Mao and her gang's efforts, who would put up posters everywhere saying, "Be alert to Deng Xiaoping's criminal attempt to exploit earthquake phobia to suppress the revolution." She would then follow up the propaganda campaign with a rally to condemn the capitalist roaders, many of whom were exploiting the victims of the earthquake to their own advantage. With the rally still being held amidst the still unfolding carnage of the humanitarian crisis, few people shared Madame Mao's zeal, and her rally was an unprecedented flop. Very few people had turned up to listen to her blistering cries, and by now it would be clearer than at any other time. Madame Mao was finished. As if things couldn't get any worse for Madame Mao, she received news that would have no doubt read like a death sentence. Her husband was dead. On the 9th of September 1976, Mao Zedong died of a heart attack at the age of 82. Although hundreds of millions sensed their freedom was at hand, the euphoria had to be swallowed away for the time being. As if to ceremonially say bon voyage to all that they had once known, good or bad, practically every citizen in the country publicly wailed for Mao. With the famous saying that the Communist Party loves the people more than their own parents, people grieved for Mao's death like they would their own father. For those that didn't convene in Tiananmen, city and town centers across the country observed the same side of public bereavement that lasted days and weeks. With many mostly unaware of how the new status quo would play out, it was better to be on the safe side, so you could later on say if you had to, "I wailed for Mao's death for a month and didn't eat at all because I was so grief-stricken." It was still far too risky not to act like Mao wasn't a god, and there was no way of knowing how many people still thought he was. One just had to hold their head down, ideally place their face into the shoulder of a stranger on the street, and cry. You could cry about anything. Family lost due to the famine, your destroyed career, your tortured relatives, your spent youth, the loss of your innocence, whatever malevolence had befallen you. Acting sad was not necessary. There were many reasons to be genuinely sad at such a time, and there had never been a time permitted for grief about anything that had happened over the past 10 years. All the evils of the time had been simply swept under the rug, with the expectation that people could simply move on and forget about whatever they had experienced. Despite the grueling attempts to transform the entirety of human nature, the social controllers couldn't withstand the one thing that opposed them: people's memory. For as long as people's memories remained subverted, could they be controlled? But no matter how hard the controllers tried, the memories of ordinary people couldn't be fully erased, creating an insurmountable obstacle for those wishing to double down on the lies. As the lies mounted up, so too did the people's memory of them increase, along with the memories of said lies and the consequences to themselves and their families. Who knew what this crazy and uncertain world would lead to? All that mattered in this moment was to take the repressed sadness about the past, the mixed feelings of an uncertain future, bundle it up and release it in a massive public catharsis. The death of Mao was genuinely a sad time for all. Although Deng Xiaoping had tried in vain to get people to continue to go to the communes for re-education till 1978, the Cultural Revolution is said to have officially ended with the death of Mao. There was just one final loose end to wrap up. Within less than a month of Mao's death, Madame Mao and her Gang of Four were put on trial and swiftly executed. Publicly cheered and mourned by no one, Madame Mao's hasty downfall was almost like a safe condemnation of Mao himself. Although many were gulled into believing that the Cultural Revolution was Madame Mao's fault, most people seemed to know otherwise by now and were no longer terrified of policing their own thoughts. Just like at the end of World War II, there were simply too many millions of people to prosecute for their crimes against humanity. Unlike in other despotic regimes, justice couldn't neatly be handed out to some corrupt bureau, because such bureau for the Cultural Revolution was the ordinary people themselves. For it was through their efforts there was no need for public organs like the KGB or the Stasi. for the tens of millions responsible for the denouncements, the humiliations, the bullying, the torture, the house raids, the kidnappings, the excommunications, the destruction of history, culture, language, love, empathy, kinship, dignity, art, music, joy. There were simply too many to prosecute. No doubt, many powerful people vowed to settle old scores with each other, but for the average person, there was simply too much hate in the world. People just wanted to get on with their lives, and whether for good or bad, people just chose to forget about it. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.